Well, thanks again. Good morning, good evening to you, wherever you may be. And thanks for the opportunity to share some of this work on the planetary boundary approach to Australian diets and sustainability of Australian diets. We say planetary boundary approach because it's the approach that was taken by the Eat Lancet report in their global reference diet. But I think everyone acknowledges that a global reference diet is academically interesting, but not of great practical value because countries have different food systems, they have different public health nutrition excuse me, challenges. And so we really need to break that down and work at a local level. And so we're doing similar work, but based on the planetary boundary framework, but in the Australian context. And I must say, my background, as you heard, is more on the environmental sciences and life cycle assessment. I know a little bit about nutrition, but all this work has been done collaboratively with experts in nutrition, working here at CSIRO. And I do stress the importance of both expertise. You know, it's no good if environmentalists start inventing things about nutrition because they really don't have that detailed expertise in that area. And it's equally dangerous if people who've got expertise in nutrition start thinking that they're going to characterise something about environmental impacts. It's important to bring the expertise together, and that's perhaps one of the strengths of the work that we've been doing here. It's still a work in progress, but some key elements are already complete, and I'll share those with you today. As an introduction, I also point out that sustainability is a very broad topic. This is just one piece of text taken from an FAO document. I don't intend for you to read it, but it talks about sustainable diets as promoting health and well-being, accessibility, affordability, safety, cultural acceptance, nutrition across the life stages, and being relevant to all forms of malnutrition. And most of those things are covered to one degree or another in dietary guidelines already, but the key element that we're adding, I guess, is relating to low environmental impacts. And as a sort of framing or starting position, this is a presentation of the Australian Dietary Guidelines on one page, a poster showing the different food groups and the different sorts of foods that are contained within each of the food groups. At the heart of nutrition is the key principle that variety is important, because no food delivers all the nutrition we need. There's no food that is perfect in terms of the environment. All food production has an environmental impact, and different foods contribute differently to the nutrient needs we have. And actually the foundation of dietary guidelines is built on the idea that we will eat a variety of foods or a diversity of foods in our diet. So when we're recommended to eat 5 serves of vegetables, it doesn't mean just eating 5 serves of carrots or something or other. We should have a rich variety of vegetables, of cereal foods, of meat and other protein foods and fruits, etc. And this is once again another snapshot from our Australian dietary guidelines. And the point about variety is in that second guideline too. Enjoy a wide variety of nutritious foods from the 5 food groups every day. Plenty of vegetables of different types and colours, legumes and beans, etc. The other 2 guidelines should not be forgotten. The first being that we should eat an amount of food consistent with our energy needs. We shouldn't just be overeating. And thirdly, at the bottom, guideline number 3, that we should limit intake of so-called discretionary or indulgent foods or energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods, which often they're not forgotten by people who work in nutrition because they make up such a substantial proportion of many people's diets. So they're a major focus of public health nutrition. But you know, people working in the academic sphere in environmental sciences often work more around agricultural production and agricultural commodities, and they forget that a lot of these agricultural commodities get processed into discretionary foods, indulgence foods, foods that we should only consume occasionally, but that they are a big part of the diet as well, and we shouldn't forget about that. So the way a lot of people address this subject of sustainability is they really sort of compare one thing versus another. So we've done a lot of these things and we can make a lot of these comparisons. So from a water scarcity footprint perspective, an apple in Australia has a water scarcity footprint of about 3 litres for a 100-gram apple, which is roughly a medium-sized apple. But if you were to consume a serve of fruit in the form of a smallish glass of orange juice, that has a water scarcity footprint of over 100 litres in Australia. So clearly the water scarcity footprint of eating apples is a lot lower than oranges, but we shouldn't imply from that that apples are preferred over oranges and that we should just concentrate on eating apples and not oranges. That wouldn't make any sense according to that principle of variety or diversity in diet. Same thing with carbon footprint. Here's a couple of examples using the GWP 100 climate metric. 2 eggs in Australia has a carbon footprint of around 167 grams, 40 grams, or a serve of cheese, 222 grams. So should we say, well, cheese is higher than eggs, we should just eat eggs and not cheese? No, that would be ridiculous, because we need this diversity, and it's not so much about comparing one food versus another as if to try and show some sort of superiority. The question's really about how can we fit all these different foods that are healthy for us to eat inside these so-called planetary boundaries. So the method we take is like the Eat Lancet approach, because they are also about fitting diets within the planetary boundaries. But in our case, we're dealing with Australian dietary intake data, including the whole of diet. So it's chocolate bars, it's cakes, it's biscuits, and all those other things that Australians like to eat and sometimes eat far too many of. It's using the Australian dietary guidelines as the lens through which we look at diet quality and nutrient reference values. It's about Australian food production data, and it's about best practice life cycle assessment metrics for environmental impact that are consistent with the international standards. And the 4 planetary boundaries that are most relevant to the food system relate to land system change, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. Fresh water use, we know that 70% of water use in the world is in the agricultural sector, so that's clearly important. Climate change and nitrogen and phosphorus flows. The first two, I'm going to present a summary of that work today. It's already published. I'll speak a little bit about climate change because that's still a work in progress. We're currently cranking those numbers through right now, actually. Nitrogen and phosphorus flows is still a future work for us. They are very important in some parts of the world where they have very dense forms of agriculture and high populations, whereas in Australia we have a very sparsely populated land with relatively low intensity of agriculture. So it's a lesser of a priority for us. So land system change. This is about the whole idea is that there needs to be a limit. We can't just turn the whole planet into croplands. There needs to be some limit to how far croplands extend. And so the people who created the planetary boundary framework have proposed that cropland should not extend beyond about 15% of the Earth's ice-free surface. Now, that's probably best understood as being a kind of a expert opinion from a group of scientists, but it gives us a reference point. Whether it should be 14 or 16 is very hard to say precisely, but based on 15%, if you break that down to the whole world's population and then the number of days in a year, it works out to be 7 square metres of cropland per person per day for a population of 7.8 billion on current global population. Or as the population is expected to grow to 9 billion or possibly beyond, obviously the share, the equitable share of that planetary boundary gets less because it has to be shared across more people, becomes only 6.1 square metres per person per day. So what we have done, we've calculated cropland scarcity footprints. This is a sort of an LCA approach. It's not just adding up all the cropland that's used, because clearly some croplands are very high productivity and some croplands are lower productivity. And it just wouldn't make any sense to add up croplands as though they were all the same. It would imply that food that's produced on the very best cropland would be more sustainable, because clearly they have higher yields and less land use per kilogram of product, or however you want to measure it. So we calculated a productivity weighted cropland footprint in the sorts of approaches that you use in LCA. And we've done that for a large data set of over 9,000 individual adult self-selected daily diets in Australia. And you can see each one of those 9,000 points plotted in the diagram there. And as you can see, the cropland scarcity footprint, some is very low, some goes very, very high. We've also calculated the diet quality score, which in this case represents effectively the degree of compliance with the Australian dietary guidelines. You see some diets are very poor, some score quite high, but it's an enormous variety. Diets in Australia are tremendously variable, both in diet quality and the demand they place on cropland. So, you know, it's really interesting when we do it at a diet by diet level, because we see this diversity and we can start to work with it, as opposed to just calculating an average, which wouldn't be terribly meaningful. And what you can see here is that in Australia, the average cropland scarcity footprint is currently 7.1 square metres. So it's thereabouts or ever slightly exceeding the planetary boundary for available cropland to support an individual daily diet. So it's currently thereabouts or maybe slightly more. But what you can see from this data, you break it down by age group and gender. You can see that people in the males, particularly in the 19 to 50 year age group, their cropland scarcity footprint is a lot higher than you know, females in the 71 and above age group, largely because it depends on how much you actually eat in total. In fact, we found almost half the variation in dietary cropland scarcity footprint relates to your total dietary energy intake. And we've looked at this data set from a lot of different angles. We've looked at how the different foods contribute on average. So you can see that fruit contributes about 9.5% of the cropland scarcity footprint, 5% from vegetables, 12% from breads and cereals, 27% from fresh meats and alternatives, of which 11.7% was from poultry, 8.8% from beef and lamb. Here it depends on both the cropland intensity of the food that's being produced, as well as how much is actually eaten. So in Australia, the most cropland intensive meats are poultry and pork, because they're fed entirely on a ration based on crop products, whereas beef and lamb is largely raised on pasture and only occasionally using crop products in feedlotting or in supplementary feeding on farm. But if you run your eye down the column there, oops, sorry, you get about halfway down, you get to discretionary foods. Actually, the biggest contribution to the cropland scarcity footprint of Australian diets is these discretionary foods at 32.7, or roughly a third. You know, they make such a huge contribution both to our energy intake and both to environmental impact. We've also looked at it from, this is getting a little detailed now, but I thought it was important to share. As I say, this is all published if you want to follow up and really examine the details. But we've looked at the current diet. Now, Australians on average don't eat the way the dietary guidelines recommend. So we've said, well, if we ate the current diet and we scaled it up to the recommended diet, what would that look like? And then we've also looked at what a recommended diet would look like if it had lower cropland intensity food choices. So you can see the first two columns is the current diet, and you can see that on average for 19 to 50 year olds, they require 7.41, the red circle at the bottom on the left-hand side, 7.41 square metres of cropland per person per day. So that's above the planetary boundary. Whoops, sorry about that. If we just scaled up the food groups, obviously scaling up, as you can see, fruit from 1.38 serves to 2 serves, and all the other core foods basically need to scale up, but discretionary foods needs to scale considerably down. So if people just sort of ate, in the same pattern as they do today, but ate the recommended diet, actually the cropland scarcity footprint would increase to 7.71. It would actually increase even further. But then we did a quadrant analysis and we looked at those diets in Australia that were both higher diet quality and lower cropland scarcity footprint. And we created a recommended diet based on those food choices. That's common, it's based on a quarter of the Australian adults. And what we found that if they ate with these lower cropland scarcity footprint food choices and ate the recommended diet, actually the cropland scarcity footprint comes down to 5.9. So well within the current planetary boundary and even within the planetary boundary for a future population of 9 billion people. So that's in summary, if you hear about cropland scarcity footprint, the land system change planetary boundary, is that we can eat the recommended diet in Australia and according to Australian dietary guidelines and be within the planetary boundary for cropland use. All we need to do is basically reduce dramatically our intake of these discretionary foods. There's still room for some because it's unrealistic not to consume any. And the other thing that needs to be done is to moderate some of our protein choices. So there's still room for variety in terms of what proteins and meats you choose to eat, but we need to be more modest in our consumption of cropland intensive poultry and pork products. So you can see that comparing the current diet with the recommended diet within the planetary boundary, it involves higher intake of seafood, higher consumption of beef and lamb, and more moderate intake of poultry and pork, and higher intake of vegetarian alternatives. So I think in summary, this is actually good news. It's saying we don't need to radically tear up the dietary guidelines and start all over again. The dietary guidelines are fine. They work within the planetary boundaries, at least within the land system change boundary. We can enjoy variety in the foods we consume, but we should also include variety in terms of the meats and other protein foods, but not be so heavily consuming the poultry foods. The second planetary boundary we've looked at is freshwater use, and here the experts are suggesting a planetary boundary of 2,800 cubic kilometres per year. But of course, we need water not only for agriculture, but we need water for industry, we need water for our homes. So the current global average is that about 70% of fresh water is used in the agricultural sector. So we've based our, if you take 70% of the planetary boundary and use it for food production and break it down by the global population again and by the 365 days a year, it leads you to an allowance of water of 695 litres per person per day for a current population of 7.8 billion, or 603 litres per person per day for a future population of 9 billion. And this is more or less what the Lancet people have done as well, although I might say they assumed the food system had 90% share of the planetary boundary of available fresh water, which you could sort of, you think, well, that doesn't leave a lot of water left for industry or for household and domestic use. 70% would be far more realistic. With the same data set of 9,341 Australian adult daily diets, we've calculated the water scarcity footprint following the ISA standard, ISA 14,046. What that standard demands is that you don't just add up water, you've got to take into account how much water is being used and the water scarcity in the locations where that water is being used, because clearly there's places in the world which is very rich in water, where saving water is not such an important environmental objective. There are other areas in the world where water is very scarce, and just adding up water as though it's all the same, it's all equivalent, is really quite ridiculous, although it's often done. It would be like saying, well, using a litre of water in somewhere like Malaysia is the same as using a litre of water in the Middle East or somewhere. The context is entirely different. So we use this international standard, and in the same way, You can see there that Australian diets are tremendously variable in diet quality and tremendously variable in water scarcity footprint, and there's no great relationship between the two. So we've once again compared these diets to the planetary boundary, and you can see the two blue vertical lines showing the planetary boundary for the population of 7.8 billion, the 695, and the planetary boundary for 9 billion people of 603 litres. And you can see there that in just about every case, Australian diets are well within all planetary boundaries. So if we look at the average of all adult diets, the top horizontal bar, the average Australian diet required 433 litres, so well below. If we looked at 19 to 50-year-old adult diets with higher diet quality and lower water scarcity footprint choices, it comes down to 245 litres. It's only that third row which represents the data for adult diets with both poorest quality diet and highest water scarcity. So these are the worst diets in Australia, the quadrant with the worst diets, then it bumps up towards the planetary boundary. But in all other cases, it's well within the planetary boundary. So we can eat the dietary guidelines, we can eat a healthy diet with variety, and we can be well within the planetary boundary for even a future global population of 9 billion. So it's good news. It's kind of relief in the sense that we don't need to throw out the dietary guidelines and radically change diets in any way. Now, the next planetary boundary, and I'm getting towards the end here because I think we've used up enough time, it relates to climate change. Now, what's the planetary boundary for climate change? Well, the only sort of global consensus is the Paris Agreement, which most countries signed up to, ratified in 2016. It's the global reference point. But what is the Paris Agreement all about? It's about climate stabilisation. It's about limiting global mean temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, or as the text says, well below 2 degrees. Already, since we started driving cars and lighting our homes with electricity and running factories and burning coal and doing all these things, the climate has warmed. It's estimated something like 1.1 degrees already. The climate has been warmed by all the human activity that we've been undertaking. The objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit the future extent of that warming, ideally to 1.5 degrees, a level of warming which is still going to have environmental and social impacts, but they are not going to be catastrophic, and they will be, in the main, largely manageable. But if we keep going on our current trajectory, the temperature could go, 1, 2, 3, 4 more degrees higher, in which case things could get very dangerous. So the Paris Agreement is about stabilising the climate. So the approach we are taking is to work with metrics that allow alignment with temperature stabilisation goals. The goal of the Paris Agreement is not to return the climate to pre-industrial climate. It's not about reducing all greenhouse gases to zero. It's about managing the radiative forcing, which is what is leading to climate change, such that the climate is stabilised. And unfortunately, mostly the metrics that people use, because of course there's different greenhouse gases. There's carbon dioxide, there's nitrous oxides, there's methane, there's other greenhouse gases, there's non-greenhouse gases that affect the climate, there's things that we do to the land surface that change reflectivity and so forth. It's a complex area, and unfortunately people often want to come up with one number, and the way they come up with that one number using the global warming potential 100 climate metric, if you're familiar with these things, doesn't really help guide you towards an alignment with temperature stabilisation goals. The two some a little bit new, but they're not really new in terms of the science. They're just becoming more prominent. These radiative forcing footprints, which is the subject of a new international standard, ISO 14082, or some of you may have heard of a new type of global warming potential called GWP star, which tries to look at equivalence in terms of temperature impact. So once again, we can start to align the results with temperature stabilisation goals. So we're in the process, and we're very busy at the moment, of calculating these metrics for all the many different types of foods that make up the Australian diet. But it's a work in progress, and I hope to share something with you in the not too distant future. So in summary, the Planetary Boundary Framework addresses the need for dietary guidance to be consistent with absolute sustainability limits. It's not about, one food fighting against another, because, we need a variety of healthy foods, but we need all those foods to add up within an envelope that is the amount of environmental impact that's sustainable. And so far as possible, sustainable diets should not limit healthy food choices, personal or cultural preferences, because healthy food options actually need to be expanded, not reduced. We need people, at least in Australia, to eat more healthy foods and cut down on the discretionary foods. So sort of arguing that certain healthy foods are not desirable is not very helpful at all. Food systems vary in different countries, as do environmental priorities, public health nutrition challenges. So a one-size-fits-all approach is not really going to be helpful at all. We've got to break it down at a country-by-country level. Most Australians could improve their diets by adhering to current dietary guidelines, eating nutritious foods according to energy needs, moderating portion sizes and frequency with which they consume discretionary foods. And finally, as the global population increases, the individual share of the planetary boundary reduces. So continuous improvement in food production and distribution systems is going to be most important. But from the work we've done so far, Australian dietary guidelines are robust and they are consistent, at least with the land system change and the freshwater planetary boundaries. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brad, for that very, very detailed presentation on the work that you've been doing. And as you said, it is quite reassuring that those environmental limits do align with current dietary guidelines. That's what we align with. I guess the challenge for those in public health and those that are trying to encourage balanced diets is that no one really does follow dietary guidelines. But
right, that's the great issue.
yeah. So, but yeah, no, that the way you've explained that is reassuring, and in a way that I think is something for us to think about in terms of approaching conversations with how we look at our food systems.